All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Matt Ewalt, and I serve the Texas Tribune as Senior Director of Events and Live Journalism. Welcome to those joining us in person here at Studio 919 in Austin, and those joining us online for our program, the 89th Legislative Session and the Future of Texas, a program in collaboration with Texas 2036. Our program today will run until approximately 10:15 or so with three different programs. We'll have some welcome remarks from leadership of the Tribune and Texas 2036. We'll have a presentation from the Dallas Fed on the Texas economy, and then we will have two panel conversations featuring our folks from Texas 2036. So that we can get to as many questions as possible today, we'll be doing all of our Q&A through our Q&A portal at texastribune.org/ask. That's texastribune.org/ask. For those in person, you'll see some signage on the cocktail tables in the back of the room with a QR code you can use. And also for those in person, if you'd like to go old school with some note cards, we have some. You can ask some questions. Our moderator, Matthew Watkins, will work those into our conversations. We'll get to welcome remarks in just a second, but want to thank everyone for being here in person and online. A reminder that this program will also be available on demand with a write-up from the Texas Tribune. So with that, let's start the program. We will start with welcome remarks from leadership of the Tribune and Texas 2036, but I want to welcome to the front of the room Texas Tribune CEO Sonal Shah.
Well, good morning, everyone. How are you? Yeah. Well, listen, you're here on a Friday before a weekend and right after a legislative session. So thank you for being here. It's important. And I also want to just a huge thank you to Texas 2036. What a great partnership and what a great team. So just want to give a round of applause to Texas 2036. Thank you. I know you'll hear from David, but can we just also thank AJ Rodriguez, because everybody knows him. I'm sure everybody knows him. He has been a great partner for us as we've been putting this event together, and really appreciate everything. Also want to thank the teams that are coming together to work on these. These are never easy events to pull together, especially when you're two groups. So thank you for doing that. It is a pleasure for us to have you all here. It is a pleasure to have this event here. But there's no one that can say this was not a consequential legislative cycle. The Texas legislature approved $338 billion in this cycle. And it represents about a 1.2% increase. We went through everything from the largest private school voucher program to school funding, boosting school funding and teacher pay, to water funding that still needs to be approved by the public, but landmark constitutional amendment dedicating $1 billion annually to pay for from the state sales tax revenue to pay for the Texas Water Fund. There is a lot happening. THC bans. There's a lot happening in the Texas legislature. But what's important about it, and I think what we'll hear about as we hear from the Federal Reserve, is really understanding what this means for the Texas economy. And at the end of the day, all of us are about Texas first. What do we do with Texas? How do we make sure Texas is growing? How do we make sure that we're growing and everybody is benefiting from it, and what does that look like? And that's why it's so important. So really appreciate having this conversation today. I want to say, for those of you that have not heard about the Texas Tribune, I hope you're reading us, and I hope you're a member of the Texas Tribune. I also, just a reminder that we will be having the Texas Tribune Festival this year in November 13th through 15th. So we'd love to have you there. There will be really important conversations, given all that's going on in the economy, given that's all that's going on in Texas. It'll give us many months in November to hear and to learn about what the consequences of the legislation and what the consequences of the decisions are. So with that, I would like to invite up David LeBron, who incredible leader of Texas 2036. Many of you know him, but I think, Matt, are you introducing him, or am I going to just allow that? Okay, thank you. Sorry. I don't know all the rules to the game here. But David, it's great to have you here. It's been great to partner with your team. Thank you for being here. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, good morning. It's great to see you all here, and I wish I could see all of you online. I'll pretend that I do. Thank you so much, Sonal, and it's great to be here just really a few days after the 89th legislative session wrapped up. We at Texas 2036 are really excited to partner with the Texas Tribune and the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. These are equally organizations concerned about the future of Texas and the welfare of all Texans. And together, what we want to do today is reflect on what happened in the past session. We don't have time to talk about everything that happened. I will say at Texas 2036, we have a pretty positive view of the things that happened and what they will mean for Texans, which isn't to say we all agree on everything. We clearly don't. But a lot of what was done positions Texas well for the future. Our mission at Texas 2036 is to really to empower Texans and, importantly, our legislators and leaders with the data and insights that they need to build a future in a very dynamic time in our world. And we're all here today to share how our work connects to these issues that matter most to Texans, from economic opportunity, infrastructure, education, healthcare, and really important, good and accountable governance by our state. We'll primarily focus today on two areas, namely education and workforce, and we see those very much together and integrated, creating opportunity both for the individuals of Texas and making sure that the businesses of Texas have the workforce they need for the future. And infrastructure. If we don't have a good infrastructure, nobody's doing well. And as I said, we believe it was a very successful legislation, and the issues that we at Texas 2036 worked on include those that I just mentioned, but also quite a number of others, such as childcare, housing affordability, cybersecurity, and other technology issues, and preparedness for wildfires. That's not a complete list, but it gives you a sense of the breadth of what we do to assure the prosperity of all Texans. And our vision is pretty simple. It is to create opportunity and prosperity for all Texans, guided by data with a focus on real results. Our legislators do work very hard during the session to improve the lives of their constituents. They don't spend 140 days at the Capitol just for the politics. They're determined to get things done. Some have said that, in fact, that they meet every the fact that they meet every 2 years actually helps get things done, right? In some ways you think, well, they only have half the time and maybe we don't get as much done. But actually, compared to a lot of other legislators, it brings an intensity and focus to the activity here in Austin that is unusual for a lot of legislators. They know they just have those days, and it keeps them focused. And a lot gets done. Texas is big, and governing it is complex, and that's where we believe we at Texas 2036 come in. We advance these data-driven strategies to tackle the largest problems that we face and the needs to be addressed to ensure future prosperity and opportunity. We start our work from well before that first gavel falls in January. In fact, I was at a meeting yesterday. I'm making my people nervous by talking about the meeting yesterday. So I'll just say somewhat vaguely, we are already thinking deeply about the next legislative session and beyond to see what the opportunities are there. We're ready to support the legislators with information they need to craft the most effective policies and make meaningful change. What unites, as I said, all the organizations represented today is this curiosity about policy and what really works, and starting really with data and reliable information. We need to understand the needs of the people in Texas and what will have an effect. We conduct at Texas 2036 research and polling to understand these needs across the state. We work side by side with civic organizations and business leaders to bring the right information to the table. And what I think really sets us apart is that we turn these ideas into action, track implementation, and evaluate the outcomes. Our work is not done when the policies that we have supported are adopted. Our work isn't even done after we assess whether it was implemented and the effects of it. Our work is then just on a kind of endless cycle. What's the next set of things we need to think about and improve? And we are optimistic here in the state of Texas. We see the dedication and hard work of our legislators. We see the results that have come out this session, and we're proud to have played a role in supporting them in achieving those results. And I said before, equally proud to work with the Texas Tribune and the Dallas Fed to help Texans understand what's at stake and what we can do about it to improve their futures. So again, I want to thank all of you for being here today, for your interest in what's going on in Texas, not only in terms of the past, but what lies ahead. And so with that, it's now my pleasure to turn it over to our friends from the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, and Guhan Venkatu is going to address us next. So welcome, Guhan.
Thank you. Well, it's a tremendous pleasure to be here today. I'd like to begin by thanking those at the Texas Tribune and Texas 2036 for putting this important program together today. Having well-informed citizens is the most reliable route to ensuring that our governments function well and address the public's priorities. Accordingly, I'm looking forward to the conversations and analysis that will follow a few minutes from now. But before we get there, my intention is to take the next few minutes to set the stage by providing an overview of the Texas economy, looking both backward and forward in an attempt to frame the conversations to come. In doing that, I'll be leaning heavily on the work of many of my colleagues at the Dallas Fed. Their research and analysis are available on our website, something I'd encourage you to check out after the program today. You can also find other important information on the 5 functions we perform to strengthen the economy for everyone, namely supervising banks, promoting financial system stability, operating parts of our nation's payment system, promoting consumer protection and community development, and carrying out our nation's monetary policy. Yes, it's a long list. Lastly, let me say that the views I'm about to express are my own, very importantly, and not necessarily those of my more capable colleagues. So with that to the side, just what is happening here in Texas? As many may know, Texas tends to be one of the strongest performing states in the US economically, something often referred to as the Texas miracle. This somewhat complicated chart shows average inflation-adjusted GDP growth, or economic output growth, across US states through roughly the last decade and a half. Each state is represented by one of the dots, with the current economic cycle shown on the vertical axis and growth through the previous cycle shown on the horizontal axis. That previous cycle ran roughly from the Great Recession through the end of the last decade. The upward sloping scatter suggests that states which did well last cycle tended to do well again, and Texas, one of the furthest points to the top and right on this chart, fared among the best. Indeed, only 3 states saw stronger GDP growth than Texas in either of these 2 periods. Perhaps not surprisingly, this strength is mirrored in the state's employment growth. This bar chart shows annual employment growth in Texas, shown by the blue bars, relative to that for the US. You can see that Texas generally sees stronger annual employment gains than the US, although the differences don't always appear to be particularly large. Indeed, in some years, like last year, employment growth in the 2 geographies is actually pretty similar. Moreover, the difference in average annual employment growth rates between Texas and the US through the period shown here is less than a percentage point. But these differences tend to be very meaningful over time. This chart shows the accumulated change in employment in Texas and in areas outside of Texas since 2000. In that time, Texas's employment has grown an astonishing nearly 50%, from around 9.5 million workers to more than 14 million workers today. By contrast, employment growth outside of Texas has been a mere 18%, or only a little more than a third as strong. All of this growth in employment and economic output has been driven to a considerable degree by the tremendous growth in population that Texas has seen through the recent past. Again, since 2000, consistent with what I just showed you on employment growth, the state has seen its population increase by almost half, from just over 20 million residents in 2000 to more than 30 million today. As shown by this bar chart, that ranks Texas fourth during this period in population growth on a percentage basis. But on an absolute basis, Texas takes the top spot, outstripping second place Florida in population growth by more than 3 million residents. The connection between population growth and employment and economic growth is important to consider. Economic output grows either because there are more workers or because those workers are able to work more efficiently. Setting aside the impact of improvements in efficiency, it's quite clear that the strong performance of the Texas economy is due in no small part to the significant increases in its population recently. Those population gains, in turn, have been driven by the state's ability to attract individuals from outside of its borders. This chart shows in-migration to Texas, both from within and outside of the US, back to the middle of the previous decade. In many of those years, 2014, 2015, and 2016, Texas added about 1% to its population from migration alone. As you can see to the right of the chart, the state has been even more successful in adding new residents through the last few years, notably in 2022, 23, and 24. To turn to risks, developments that limit these flows are likely to limit the state's economy and associated growth. One such development is related to housing availability and affordability. In a report issued late last summer, the state's comptroller noted that while Texas tends to be seen as a low-cost state and thus attractive to prospective new residents, the state has seen a decline in housing affordability recently. Indeed, by one measure, housing costs have risen by about 50% statewide through just the last 5 years. While concerning, it's also worth noting that the state fares well when considering planned per capita construction, which is what's shown here. By that measure, Texas ranks in the top 10. Measures to increase the state's housing supply should help to ease concerns about affordability, and to that extent, Texas looks like it's in relatively good shape. That said, another development that could affect state growth relates to changes to the nation's trade policy. As shown here, Texas is one of the most trade-intensive states in the country, ranking 5th according to this measure, which considers total trade, that is both imports and exports, as a share of state GDP. One noteworthy fact here is that Texas actually enjoys a trade surplus, which is to say that the state exports more than it imports by value. According to an estimate from the U.S. Department of Commerce, almost 1 million jobs in Texas depend on the state's export shipments. Consequently, disruptions to the state's exports could have important implications for employment and economic activity. Adequate water supplies are also vital to the state's ability to grow. Water is, of course, critical to the development of new neighborhoods, but also important in a variety of growing industries, such as semiconductor production and the development of data centers, as well as in agriculture. According to the Texas Water Development Board, the state already faces a water availability deficit under drought conditions, which is what I'm showing you here. This entity projects that this will worsen without the development of new sources of supply, as well as renewed attention to conservation efforts. Similarly, adequate energy is necessary to continue to power the state's growth. This chart shows peak summer demand projections for electricity from ERCOT, the organization operating the primary electrical grid here in Texas. This entity expects electricity demand to increase by more than 50% by 2030, both because of traditional factors such as strong growth in population and economic activity, but also because of new factors like demand from data centers and electric car charging. Will we have enough energy to meet these demands? A recent analysis from the University of Houston suggests that the answer may be no. Even under more modest expectations for growth, researchers there believe that the state may face an electricity deficit early in the next decade without additional investments in new generation capacity. Before concluding, since I've talked a bit about other resources, let me take a moment to touch on the state's human resources, also a key ingredient in ensuring the state's continued economic vitality and vibrancy. This chart shows the share of non-elderly adults who don't have health insurance in Texas and the US. As you can see, the share in Texas is almost twice the national average, with Texas ranking last among all states on this measure. Even among employed individuals, uninsurance rates are about double the national average in Texas, almost 20% here, relative to roughly 10% nationally. Aside from the implications for individuals' well-being, there are, of course, broader consequences for the economy overall. Indeed, at least one study shows that expanded access to health care for children results in increased participation in the labor force later in life. Speaking of investments in children, let me conclude with what might seem like an unexpected bit of good news about the quality of public education here in the Lone Star State. The National Assessment of Educational Progress is a congressionally mandated program that evaluates education quality in the US. Among other areas, it assesses reading and math proficiency in the 4th and 8th grades. Though the unadjusted results suggest otherwise, after adjusting for factors like poverty and whether English was or wasn't spoken most often at home, Texas's schools actually scored very high, ranking in the top 10. Clearly, preparing students well is one of the best ways to secure the state's future and ensure that Texas remains one of the strongest performing states economically through the next decade and beyond. With that background, let me turn things over to Matthew Watkins, Editor-in-Chief of the Texas Tribune.
So as we get our stage set for our first panel conversation that indeed will be moderated by my colleague, Matthew Watkins, our editor-in-chief, I just want to thank Guhan for his presentation and a reminder that you will be able to review what he has presented on demand on the Texas Tribune website. So we're going to transition into our first panel conversation of the morning, which is titled Future Ready Texas, Legislative Pathways from Classroom to Career. I want to introduce two folks from Texas 2036. That's John Horchak, Senior Vice President for Policy and Advocacy at Texas 2036. John leads the overall Texas 2036 policy team, and a fellow Texas 2036 member, Mary Lynn Prunetta, Director of Education and Workforce Policy for Texas 2036. Matthew Watkins, our Editor-in-Chief, will get the conversation started here in just a second. A reminder that we will do some Q&A from our audience throughout the conversation here. You can ask your questions at texastribune.org/ask, or if you're in the room and you want to write your question down for me, just raise a hand and I'll make sure and get you a card. And with that, I turn the program over to Matthew Watkins.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Matt, and thank you everyone for being here. Looking forward to this conversation on education and workforce issues. One more reminder, texastribune.org/ask. I will get your questions right here on my phone. If I'm looking at my phone, I'm not playing the Wordle. I am reading your questions, and I will try to sprinkle them in throughout the conversation. But thank you all both for being here. All right, so let's talk a little bit. I mean, this is an education conversation. This was, of course, a very big session for education, came in kind of being, I would say, maybe the most hyped issue on the table. A lot of attention going to the issue of school vouchers, school choice, and things like that. But I actually want to start with HB2, which you could argue may be more consequential than the school voucher bill, and will really have a lasting impact on education in the state and for the people in the state. Can y'all sort of break down for me first kind of the big picture look at that bill, and then we'll get into some kind of the details beyond there?
Yeah, great. And I would agree with you in terms of the size and scope, because when we think about the size of the school voucher program, it's about 2%, 3% of the children in Texas. So when we're talking about HB2, that's the other 97%. That's millions and millions of children whose lives will be improved by this bill. Marilyn, do you want to dive in what's in there?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, House Bill 2 is an $8.5 billion investment in our public schools on top of the $80, $90 billion that we're already putting into our public school system. So it's a significant investment in and of itself. But I think one of the great things that House Bill 2 does is it attempts to solve a lot of the problems that we're experiencing in public education right now. Less than half of our students can read or do math on grade level, according to the kind of the nation's report card, or the NAEP. And then at the same time, we have a crisis in too many uncertified teachers in the classroom. About half of the teachers that were hired in the state of Texas recently are uncertified. This is a big deal because an uncertified teacher has been shown by research to cause about a 4-month decline in reading proficiency. And so that means we have a lot of big systemic problems that we have to address that House Bill 2 starts to work towards. It does things like paying teachers more to keep our teachers in the classroom. It does reading and math screeners so that we can begin to address these problems that we have in proficiency in the earliest grades. It also puts more money into the pockets of school districts by providing hundreds of millions of dollars in special education funding that districts were sorely needing. So it's structurally designed to address a lot of these systemic issues, and that's why I think it has so much promise.
Okay, let's talk about the funding first, because that is a big part of this. $8.5 billion, as you mentioned. That is a lot of money, being touted as the kind of biggest individual investment in Texas schools in history. It follows a period of, I think, real financial difficulty for schools. A lot of schools running deficit budgets. There was, of course, some money held back in the last legislative session because the school voucher bill could not come through. Help me kind of put this in context of kind of what the impact of this does, and what do we know about how far this will go toward addressing some of the deficit issues that school districts around the state have been facing?
So one of the things that I think we have to do is always kind of pull up and think about the context of the past few years. In 2019, we had a $6 billion investment in public education, and then the pandemic happened. And then we had somewhere between $17 and $19 billion in federal assistance coming to districts, but that money was always going to expire. And so this session, we were at this precipice. The money that districts had become accustomed to from the federal government was going away. We needed to continue investments. Meanwhile, inflation, the cost of living, particularly for our teachers, going up and up. And so I do think that House Bill 2 was of the moment. It was well-timed. It will help districts address some of these budget issues, but we're going to continue to see some of those going forward as well.
Okay. And now let's go into some of those provisions, right? One of the big ones, as you mentioned, is teachers. So there's things related to certification. There's also just teacher pay, right? Significant increases or money set aside for raising teacher salaries this year. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so it pays based on experience, kind of at the start. So what it does is around $2,000 to $5,000 for our more new teachers, and then for our more experienced teachers, somewhere between $5,000 to $10,000, depending on the school district. And then it also does things like include funding to encourage teachers that are uncertified and currently in the classroom to go and get certified. So it's doing a lot, and then it's also got some other protections for teachers. It's a very teacher-focused and pro-teacher piece of legislation.
I want to drill into the uncertified question, because this is one that really fascinates me. We have seen in recent years a massive increase of uncertified teachers coming into the classroom and teaching in Texas schools. What is the reason for that?
I think one of the problems is, we've had a lot of jobs that we've needed to fill in our school districts, in part because we had a large surplus of money coming in from the pandemic, and districts were trying to find people to do the job of remediating students after the single greatest learning loss we've seen in the history of our country. And so that created a very unique point in time. But then also we saw people just less interested in becoming a teacher. I mean, if you think about your friends and neighbors, how many of them do you think are actively talking to their sons and their daughters about becoming teachers? That's not really one of the careers that people are turning their children to, and I think that's a tragedy, because one of the things that I think is truly remarkable about the teaching profession, if you think about it, if you think about a teacher trying to provide reading instruction to a class of second graders, she's got, let's say, 22 second graders in her class, she's literally doing neurosurgery. She's individually providing remediated instruction or differentiated differentiated instruction to different students based on different needs. Is there any job more complex than that? I think the level of skill that's required to truly become a master teacher is something that we just haven't acknowledged much as a country. And I think it's something that House Bill 2 is a piece of us beginning to turn the tides toward. We need to continue to focus on lifting up the profession.
Yeah, and I think one of the real goals, and this started with House Bill 3 in 2019 and really kind of put on steroids by House Bill 2 this session, is not just the across-the-board pay raises, not just the differentiation based off of the style of certification, but truly rewarding the highest performing teachers as determined by their school district. So we have those tiers, those master teachers under House Bill 3. Before it was you get up to $32,000 extra per year. Now it's even higher after House Bill 2. That is a significant amount of money in terms of getting the highest performing teachers into those six-figure ranges, because these are hard jobs and we want the best and brightest going into them. We want people to see a career, not just a transient stop. And because experience matters, training matters, and over the long term, these investments in our human capital of the teacher workforce will pay off for the overall state workforce.
Yeah, talk a little bit more about that experience matters. I mean, because a lot of the advocates calling for steps in this range, we're really talking about how that training, there are kind of, there is data that would demonstrate that this is really important in terms of student outcomes, right? In order to have those certified and trained teachers on, in the classroom.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that we've seen in the data is that an uncertified teacher causes around 4 months of kind of learning loss or learning lag in reading and around 3 months in mathematics. That's a huge problem when you have a large number of students in the state that are already coming into each and every grade with a deficit.
Yeah, I would add that it's not just about having a great teacher that's well paid. You have to equip them to succeed. The state has made big investments in high quality curriculum. The state is making investments in additional days to the school year this session. Those are things that address learning loss. Those are things that help even your best teachers succeed more. I think that when you think about this as a comprehensive strategy, not just one thing in isolation, that's where the real benefit of House Bill 2 and many of the other pieces that were passed this session come through.
How would you what would you sum up that strategy as? I mean, what is the overarching strategy they're taking here?
Conveniently, it's in House Bill 2 and House Bill 120. They redefine the goals of public education this session. It's a part of that isn't talked about a lot, but there's literally at the top of the education code, we talk about what are we trying to achieve here with this, $70-80 billion in annual investment on millions of Texas children. It is not just reading on grade level, math on grade level. That's what we said before. Now we have added 2 key goals to the goal of public education. First, we want all children who graduate from a Texas public high school to graduate career ready for the workforce of Texas. And we want to make sure that every Texas child who wishes to pursue post-secondary education can do so without the need for remediation. Those are really high standards, really high goals. When you think about, the economy and what our future needs are, that's the kind of stuff that's going to leverage the fact that Texas has more children. We have 10% of America's children are in Texas public schools. When you think about what it's going to take to drive the economy forward for decades to come, it's leveraging that career readiness, that college readiness, and making sure our kids are ready for the economy of tomorrow.
So there was an agreement on this strategy. The question then is, was it enough? How much is this going to move kind of the ball forward and toward those goals?
In terms of student outcomes or in terms, yeah. So I think that's really the most important thing. So I think every piece of education legislation that we pass every session just has to come down to this fundamental question. Are more children going to read and do math on grade level, or are more children going to graduate ready for college and career? And I think that House Bill 2 does move the needle towards both of those things. I think from the early literacy interventions to the things that it's doing in career and technical education, it is absolutely going to move the ball forward. And every session we're going to come back, my whole career, everyone's always been like, this is not an education session. And then it always ends up becoming an education session. So next session, when we find ourselves in another education session, we'll continue to find more ways to improve those 3 metrics.
Let's talk about something that did not make it across the finish line, the accountability bill, HB 4, I believe, if I have it right. Tell us a little bit about what was on the table there and how we ended up.
Yeah, I think the House Bill 4 had various permutations depending on where it was in the process. I think that while a lot of the conversation was about the differences between the bills, there's a lot in common between them. I think regardless of where you were in the House or the Senate or on the political spectrum, everyone agreed that it was time to move away from the STAR exam to this idea of a through-year assessment. We needed to know how kids were doing at the beginning of the year, how they're doing in the middle of the year, and how they're doing at the end. We wanted to make sure that the STAR could be, or the subsequent assessment could be used to drive instruction, to allow intervention, not just after kids have left for the summer, they get a score. People wanted tests back faster. They wanted them to be shorter. They wanted them to be more tailored in an adaptive way so that you could sit down in a few minutes and get an understanding. All of that was generally agreed upon between all the stages of the bill. Unfortunately, there are trade-offs when one are doing these tests. And I think those trade-offs really came at the end, and they ran out of time without being able to resolve them. So, when you think about, there was a provision in the bill that said you could have no questions above grade level. Well, if you're trying to design an adaptive test that's as short as possible, one of the ways that you do that is by asking questions that are too hard. And that's how you can very quickly figure out how the test should be structured. So when you put in these provisions that make it contradictory and impossible to implement, and then you run out of time at the end before you're able to resolve that, it leads to some challenges. But what leads me optimistic is how frankly close I think the sides were at the end. And so we have, 2 years to get this right. And I do think that in 2027 they will.
Before we move on to some more career workforce, I do want to ask an audience question, which was, you mentioned briefly teacher-student ratios. Will there still be a shortage of teachers in the aftermath of this law? What will this do for the teacher-student ratios in this state?
I do think it's worth noting that the teacher-student ratio conversation is one that is a data quirk in Texas of sorts. At the same time, the conversation has been about the difficulty in hiring new teachers and hiring quality teachers. We've also had more teachers employed in Texas public classrooms than at any point in Texas history. We've also had the best student-to-teacher ratios than at any point in Texas history. So there's this push-pull going on in terms of these various pressures. I think some of the things that are being done in the bills in terms of mentorship and grow your own and developing some of the things that we've seen really work in communities, like what El Paso is doing in terms of their mentorship program, partnering with UTEP, getting those student teachers in there and then having them graduate ready to immediately walk into a classroom, scaling those kinds of highly productive models. You see that throughout House Bill 2, whether it's the rural CTE programs or the P-TECH programs that have been thriving up in the Dallas area. These things that are highly impactful, and we can show with the data that when there's proper implementation, it drives incredible outcomes for teachers and for students. All of that is scaled by House Bill 2.
Okay, let's talk about the kind of career education space, at high schools, community colleges, and things like that. There were several bits of legislation, dating back to past sessions, but, carrying that momentum forward this time. What are the ones that stand out to y'all as the most exciting, the most interesting that the legislature passed this year?
One of the things that I think has been very exciting is the state's commitment to community college finance and making sure that we have what I think is probably the best community college finance system in the country. And with bills like SB 1786, making sure that we can clean up some of the issues with the prior version of the legislation and make sure that things like credentials of value are going to be at the highest level of quality. And one of the things that I think is so exciting and so innovative that the legislature did is actually make it so that when we have a credential of value conversation, we're not talking about really at the state level. We can pull a credential of value at the state level, but we can also do it at the regional level. I'm from Abilene. The jobs in Abilene are vastly different than the jobs in Austin, vastly different than the jobs in El Paso or in Diboll. And so making sure that we're actually regionalizing our credentials of value is just, I think, one of those things that's just going to help continue to support economies, particularly the rural ones or the more remote ones in our state. That coupled with the reforms that were in House Bill 2 or House Bill 120 around investing and expanding career and technical options like innovative high schools like the P-TECH model or the RPEP model, I think we'll continue to just kind of build this out. One of the things, going back to the data and going back to how are our students actually doing, there's a 10 percentage point gap between the performance of young men and young women when it comes to higher education attainment in Texas. We have got to provide programs for our young men that they're interested in and that they want to pursue so that they have just as much access to good jobs that can support a family.
Yeah, I think what we're doing right now in high school in Texas today is going to be the national model. So you hear a lot of coverage about the Mississippi Miracle, all the things they've done for reading. What we're doing in high school, what we're building on high school is going to be what every other state is copying in the next 5 years. We know that in part because they're already copying us on community colleges. And what we are doing right now through House Bill 2, House Bill 120, and Senate Bill 1786 is scaling that community college into high school with that idea of career connectivity, workforce exploration. A lot of bills have passed this session that really drive at that idea. And to Mary Lynn's point, what I see when I look at these bills is it's no longer just about the triangle. It's a 254 county economic development strategy, leveraging our human capital in every area about how to meet their regional workforce demands. We're fixing the systems, the incentives, the data behind the scenes to make it truly a vibrant workforce picture for the 30 million Texans.
I was in Colorado earlier this week with a bunch of higher education administrators and leaders, and they talked a lot about Texas, not all of it positive, but one of the things that
They're
came
one
up,
of the ones calling us.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. One of the things that they did talk about a lot was HB 8 from last session and how that had become sort of a national model and something that folks want to emulate and follow, very much so after that. Okay, I want to go back to an audience question here. Did the recent ledge session address any of the challenges related to the school financing formula, particularly recapture?
So one of the questions that we always get when it comes to school finance is recapture. And so I want to first ground us in, well, what is recapture? Recapture is just a mechanism to ensure equity in the school finance system. Before we put recapture in place, there was a 700-to-1 ratio difference in the most affluent schools in the least affluent schools in school finance. So when it comes to recapture, it is a tool to lower that ratio to the smallest amount that we can. And so I'll say, anytime that you put more money in public education, you lower recapture. So yes, it did lower recapture, but recapture will continue because I think in Texas, it's not something that we're going to accept that one district would have 700 times more funding than another district.
There was a pretty strong commitment in both chambers to putting a significant amount of money into schools this session, using that large surplus in large part to support the schools. One of the things that they sort of had to iron out was what to allocate that money for. How much of it do you want to put into the basic allotment, which can be spent for, a lot of different reasons, or how much do you want to specifically target that for things like teacher raises or other options? Can you tell us a little bit about how that kind of breakdown ended up, and does it carry significance, the decisions they made along those lines?
So one of the ways, kind of at a high level, so House Bill 2 spent $8.5 billion. Around $1 billion of it went to the allotment for basic cost. And then $4 billion plus went towards paying teachers more. A couple $100 million, around $700 or $800 million, went to special education. And then the rest of the money was spent kind of in programmatically directed ways, we'll say. So when you think about House Bill 4, majority of it's going to teachers. We're literally into the pockets of teachers across the state. Others of it are going to school systems to help them improve the way that they're operating and allow them to pay other staff besides teachers more money. And then I think one of the things that we should continue to focus on is special education and continuing to think about bettering that formula. That's going to be a huge piece of work over the legislative interim to make sure that the formulas that we're constructing around special education, which still largely have to be written, are doing the very best things possible for children in the most differentiated way possible, because particularly our special education students just have vastly different needs.
Okay, I'm going to go to another audience question, which is, right now, our school districts are cutting arts programs, particularly those that are not the largest or most popular. I'm hearing that more money is being invested into schools. Why the discrepancy? Is there a lag for when more money will be available to schools? What is the effect of the movement to focus more on basics rather than, quote, extras, such as arts education?
So one of the things that I think that we have to remember too is that in Texas we do still believe in local control, and we do still believe in districts getting to make the budgetary decisions that they need to support their communities and what their community is interested in. But school districts are also grappling with this phenomenon of the patterns of their enrollment are deeply changing. You have some suburban school districts with the west side of the district growing at 10% a year, and then the east side of the district is actually declining in attendance. And school districts districts are having to balance all of these things and having to keep some schools open that are at 40 or 50% capacity. And that creates downstream budget consequences that the district has to deal with. I think that the posture of the state should be to continue to allow districts to make local budgetary decisions while we're also continuing to encourage them to advance things and improve student outcomes in the 4 core subjects. So.
Okay, and one other question, and I appreciate the audience member for asking. We should talk a little bit about SB2, the school voucher ESA program and everything like that. You know, this was one that passed fairly early in the session. It feels like a long time ago now, but you know, clearly one of the top priorities of the governor, a major change in how we do school funding in the state. What are y'all going to be watching about that program and how it rolls out in the coming months and years?
Yeah, so it'll take some time to get up and running. I don't think this upcoming school year it'll be in place. It'll be the following school year. And so there's a lot that needs to be worked out to make sure that as the program is implemented, it has the level of transparency and accountability that you want over any taxpayer-funded program. I think that there's going to be, just in terms of the operations of it, it's a new thing, and new things can go, there are always hurdles that you have to go through in implementation. We'll have a new comptroller that's going to be tasked with implementing it. Who that is going to be is a big open question right now. So there's a lot of things like that that are kind of still unresolved, even though the bill itself is signed and becoming law. So I think that implementation piece and then the follow through at the end to make sure that, again, we are an organization that cares deeply about transparency and accountability over all government funds, regardless of what the program is. And so making sure that we get the outcomes that I think people hoped for.
Okay, we are nearing the end of our time, so I want to just ask an open-ended question to both of you, which is there anything under the radar that you feel like really, people should be thinking about or talking about related to these topics, that passed this session?
Yeah, I think one of the things that has completely been under the radar this session is how good the legislature reformed prison education. So that's not a thing that gets talked about much at all. But through the Texas Department of Criminal Justice sunset bill that passed the session, plus some provisions in the community college finance bill, we're going to be able to redo how prison education works, to put educators in charge, be able to leverage dual credit, to have the community colleges more immersed into the prison education context. Because one of the things that we know, and this isn't rocket science, is that if you leave prison with the skills and credentials necessary to find a job, you are more likely to find a job. And if you find a job, you're less likely to recidivate. It's not crazy. But when you look at the data in terms of like the wait lists to get into TDCJ education, it was 1 in 10 students were able to get in under the old system. And the legislature has made massive strides across multiple bills this session to solve that gap, to start closing that, and make education and workforce training a key part of our state's criminal justice policy.
What about you, Marilyn?
I think what I'll add that's under the radar is, again, going back to this meta-narrative in Texas. Since 2019, I really truly believe that the legislature has done a phenomenal job in slowly building on these cycles of reform to create a really comprehensive and really strong policy landscape. From House Bill 3's College Career and Military Readiness Outcomes Bonus to the reforms in House Bill 8 with the community college finance system, and now continuing to build on that with House Bill 2 and House Bill 120. I think they're pulling in the same direction, and I think that direction is a better Texas. And so I'm a Texas optimist. I'm so thankful for this state, and I'm thankful for the legislature in their kind of coordinated and cohesive approach. And I don't believe that they get the credit that they should for how thoughtful and meticulous that they've been over the past 6 or 7 years.
Okay, we have time for, I'll go into one more audience question, which is Texas used to have a strong technical training track, but a lot of that went away in the 1990s. Did that change with this session?
I think that the dignity of technical education has really been a core feature of the legislature over the last couple sessions, and that they've made a lot of key investments. The one I'll point to immediately is this session passed an endowment for the Texas State Technical College. You as voters will have the opportunity this November, should you choose to vote. Please do. What that'll do is allow the Texas State Technical Colleges to have an endowment to create new campuses, new labs, et cetera, to really, again, drive in that workforce connectivity in education. It has been a consistent theme throughout. I mean, in redefining the goals of public education to include workforce readiness as a bare minimum for every Texas student. That's 370,000 students per year that we're putting that kind of on right there. That is such a huge step and so responsive to the things that Marilyn was talking about. When we talk about, like, we have this problem in Texas, 90% of our kids are graduating. That is awesome. That is really high. About 60% of jobs require some sort of post-secondary degree or credential, and about 30% of our youth are getting them. Getting that 30 closer to first 60, hopefully all the way up to 90, that is the task of the next few years. And between the bills that have passed, we are certainly on that trajectory. And it's why I believe that we are going to be the national model, because we have not only the humans, but the resources to go off and rewrite what education means.
Excellent. Well, the two of you, I'm sure, had a very busy legislative session. Thank you for joining us on a Friday morning. I know you're already doing the work on 2027, but hopefully you get some rest. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, we thank John and Mary Lynn for their guidance on these issues. And as we move to our second panel, just want to introduce both of our panelists for a conversation on building for growth, how Texas lawmakers approached key infrastructure and budget issues. And we have joining us Jeremy Mazur and Rahul Srinivasan. Let me quickly introduce both. Jeremy directs Texas 2036's work in the area of infrastructure and natural resources, which includes water, oil, and gas, and energy. And Rahul joined Texas 2036 in October 2022 and covers the policy areas of state budget and government performance, as well as workforce. I thank Jeremy and Rahul for joining us. Turn the program over to Matthew.
All right, thank you both for being here. Once again, texastribune.org/ask. Appreciate those questions on the last panel. Hope to get some more great ones this time.
It's great to be here, Matthew.
Yeah,
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Yes. All right. So a busy session for y'all too. A lot of money in the budget to spend. Major issues related to water and energy. I want to start with water because the state, it was a big topic leading into the session. The state made a major investment in this issues. Tell us a little bit about where they landed on this topic.
Well, for once, water was not a dry subject this session. So sorry, I had to do the dad joke.
Every time we talk about water, there's some kind of water pun.
It can be pretty slick. So water was, this was a huge session for water. I would say it's perhaps the most consequential, historic session we've seen for Texas water policy, if not this century, but at least in 50 years. And it all has to do with the state's financial strategy. We know the state needs to invest at least $154 billion in the long term, over the next 50 years, on expanding our water supplies and fixing our aging, deteriorating drinking water and wastewater systems that are really becoming problems in the communities they serve. Case in point, what happened in Marlin earlier this year, as the Tribune reported. So the legislature recognized that if we want to have this Texas economic miracle continue, if we want economic growth, if we want to sustain this population growth, we have to have reliable water infrastructure in place. And so they made water infrastructure a large priority. And what they did was they approved a two-step financial strategy. The first was a $2.5 billion down payment towards our water infrastructure funds and the Water Development Board. But the second, which could be perhaps more consequential, is a long-term $20 billion over 20 years revenue dedication to the Texas water funds. And again, these can be used to expand our water supplies and fix these aging systems. So yes, 2025 is going to go down in the history books as the most consequential session for water.
Let's take a step back. I want to drill more into what you just said, but first I want to talk about the challenge that the state faces with water. That $154 billion number that you mentioned over the next 50 years needed. What is what exactly is the need there? What is the situation we were in heading into this legislative session with regard to water?
Matthew, it boils down to two buckets. The first is the issues and as the Federal Reserve spokesman said earlier, is we are a drought-prone state and we really need to expand and diversify our water supplies. If we fail to do this, when we look at Water Development Board data that's been adjusted for inflation, we're looking at $165 billion in GDP losses per year within the next 20 years. The other bucket that we have, a water issue infrastructure bucket, has to do with the problem with aging, deteriorating drinking water and wastewater systems. In the Tribune, I have to give your reporters credit. They've done a remarkable job on reporting on communities such as Zavala, Laredo, Odessa, and Marlin that are suffering at and at the mercy of their aging, deteriorating, and failing water systems. Our data suggests that these problematic systems inflict a series of small economic cuts on the communities that they serve. And over the long term, these small economic cuts amount to a meaningful economic wound to the tune of about $320 billion in total over the next 20 years. And so what we're seeing is that not having reliable water infrastructure, meaning having enough water supplies or reliable water systems that aren't prone to break or fail, really could become a liability to the state's economy. And the legislature saw that. And that's why I think that's one of the key reasons why they made water infrastructure a key priority.
Okay, so let's talk about these numbers here. On the one hand, $20 billion over 20 years, plus another $2.5 billion, that's $22.5 billion. That is a lot of money to spend on water. On the other hand, $154 billion is a lot more than that. Help me put this into context in terms of if I'm someone who's worried about water and the water future of our state, how I should be looking at how this wrapped up. Should I be saying this is great, look at this massive investment, or should I say where's the other $132 billion coming from?
Of course, that's a reasonable question. So we know that we have to invest $154 billion in the long run over the next 50 years towards addressing our water infrastructure challenges. The good news is that there's already existing state and federal programs that are going to account for a portion of that $154 billion. And so we estimate that leaves a long-term water infrastructure funding gap of just north of $110 billion, again, over the next 50 years. So this $22.5 billion, Matthew, you're raising a good question. Will it solve or close that water infrastructure funding gap in the long run? Facially, no, it's not going to do that. It could likely fall short. However, there are several things that can happen that can really expand the potential of this funding boost. First, it could be leveraged with existing bonding programs to finance even more. Second, it could invite private capital and public-private partnerships for the development of water infrastructure projects. And then third, even though the legislature made this historic step this year with the $2.5 billion appropriation, and if voters approve the $20 billion dedication in the long term, there's nothing in the Constitution or state law that prohibits the legislature from making additional appropriations in the future. If anything, what we've done in 2025 is basically set our state's financial strategy on the right track to have consistent baseline funding that at a bare minimum is needed in the long run.
Rahul, you are a resident budget expert. Tell me about the significance of that sort of automatic disbursement. Assuming that this is approved by the voters, which we can talk a little about more here in a minute. Why is it meaningful to have that sort of, be happening automatically as opposed to, at the whims of lawmakers each individual session?
Well, I think you have some of that answer contained in the question. I mean, fundamentally, all the decisions that happen here are made by the lawmakers. But since the budget is not actually a permanent document, I mean, all these other bills are statutes, or we have constitutional amendments that live there until we change them. The budget's a 2-year document. So when you have something like funding for water, or it's very similar to the setup that we did with the State Highway Fund a couple years, 10 years ago, a couple years ago is wrong now, but you're talking about creating this reliable source of funding that it's a reflection that the legislators saw that this is an important enough infrastructure priority that we need to create this reliable built-in source of revenue so that we don't let our attention go away and start doing different things. So, I mean, it makes it more insulated from the politics of the moment.
When we talk about the water challenges that Texas faced, you could kind of put it into two buckets. Accidental water pun there, I guess. But there is the idea of supply, right? There's is there enough water to serve the growing population of the state? And then there is the idea of efficiency and the strength of the existing water infrastructure that is already here. So that's, if Texas pipes did not leak to the extent that they did, we would need much less water than we do right now in order to serve the state. That was, I think, where some of the kind of back and forth played out during this legislative session of how much do you invest in this bucket? How much do you invest in this bucket? How did we kind of shake out there?
There was a fascinating policy debate, and indeed there was a tension between the issue of water supply and fixing your failing systems. The earliest proposals were heavily weighted towards water supply. The policy conversation around that was fascinating to listen to, and it's something that probably a lot of Texans would agree with, where the point was like, we're a drought-prone state, we're a growing state, we need to have these water molecules to begin with, because if you don't have them, any problem that you have with your aging, deteriorating, failing system is immaterial because you don't have any water. There's a lot of legitimacy to that. But then on the flip side, legislators are also saying, well, hey, we have these problems in these towns like Laredo, Odessa, Marlin, Zavala, where the systems are failing, they're leaking enough water to fill up a major storage reservoir every year. We got to fix that in order to help our supply issue, our supply problem. That too is a valid argument. At the end of the day, they reached a very reasonable compromise that literally split the baby, where at least 50% can go to water supply projects, and the remaining portion will go to water infrastructure, but also flood control and mitigation.
And how will that be decided? How will that be kind of dispersed out?
It's basically instructed by Senate Bill 7, which was authored by Chairman Charles Perry and sponsored by Cody Harris. It says that at least 50% shall go to water supply projects, which means that the Water Development Board could allocate more than 50% to water supply projects. And then it's basically up to project sponsors to apply for the remaining funds for either flood control or fixing their systems to avoid the leaks.
Okay. So, well, let's talk about the vote here. It'll be a ballot proposition in November, not usually a particularly high turnout period in those odd-numbered years. How are people feeling about, the next step being taken by Texas voters here?
I think water politically is a winner. We see that in the voting patterns in the Texas House, in the Texas Senate. In 2023, 77% of voters, three out of four, approved Proposition 6, creating the Texas Water Fund. Our polling at Texas 2036 suggests two things. First, voters are really concerned about the reliability of their water infrastructure. In some areas, they worry if there's enough water to come out of their taps, and in other areas, they're really worried about having to put up with these boil water notices or discolored water coming out of their taps. So voters are worried about their water infrastructure. The other thing that we find is voters, both ours and Republicans and Democrats, are strongly supportive of state investments in water infrastructure, especially if it's needed for continued economic growth and prosperity.
Okay, very good. All right, let's start talking about the broader budget here. Rahul, this is your area of expertise. The budget is arguably the most important bill every legislative session, and maybe the most difficult to understand as well. You have the unenviable task of understanding it. So I will turn to you and ask first, just for some kind of top line takeaways, what stands out to you about this measure that passed this legislative session?
I think what's funny about what happens out of this process every year or every 2 years is that it's always a this might be a little bit of a redundant thing, but it's always a reflection of the politics that govern the chambers at that time, And so, right now, I mean, you saw, I think, a lot of commitment to the investments that, we heard the Dallas Fed talk earlier about the Texas Miracle, and I think you saw legislators prioritize a lot of the key budget investments that will continue that Texas Miracle. And, and a lot of that, you can talk about the built-in things that are always there with education and health and human services, but a lot of that's already mandated with how through federal law or through state law. But I think what's notable for the second session in a row is you saw significant investment in infrastructure, obviously water. You saw tremendous investments in energy. You're talking about investments in things like abandoned oil well plugging and nuclear energy. You're talking about investment in space. And so what you see a lot of this is this kind of continuation, and it's also a reflection of the strong revenue cycles that we've had the last two cycles. So it's given legislators kind of that flexibility to do bigger things. And so I think that as much as there's a lot of headlines, and for me, my head always goes to the boring stuff, because when you're looking at a 1,000-page document, it's not just the big things that you read about in the paper. It's about what are state salaries, what's the money we're putting in towards pensions, how are we trying to make sure premiums don't go up for state employees and things like that. Or the thing that I tend to talk about and make people's eyes roll is stuff like IT modernization, and so there was a significant commitment in trying to make government work better and set us up for ensuring Texas is better able to serve the economy and the people that live here.
All right, so since we're on the topic of infrastructure, let's talk about energy for a little bit.
Sure.
There have been various reports coming out in recent years about massive growth in energy demand in the state, driven both by population growth, but maybe even more so by things like AI data centers, Bitcoin mining, other different kind of modern technologies coming onto the grid that are very energy intensive. This is, of course, a scary thing for those of us who lived through the 2021 freeze. We do not want to go through one of those things again, and I think it's probably fair to say that our elected officials would not like to have that happen again as well. What did the state do with regard to energy expansion? What is in that budget that's?
I mean, and Jeremy, you can jump in too, but obviously they put in more money into the Texas Energy Fund that was established last session that voters approved. They made an additional appropriation of $5 billion. And then you also see the money that was put towards the Advanced Nuclear Energy Fund, $350 million, I believe, there. I think a lot of this is in service, and Jeremy, please jump in too. In service of trying to make sure that we have the different sources and the ability to serve all the new energy, all the industries and the demands of the future Texas.
100%. One of the things that was really fascinating to me this session was the legislature's bullish interest in nuclear power.
Yeah.
There was the appropriation that we saw in the budget that you've pointed out, Rahul. They approved House Bill 14 by Chairman Cody Harris, as well as Senate Bill 1535 by Senator Zaffirini, each of which tried to provide both regulatory and policy frameworks for nuclear energy development, but also for the nuclear energy workforce. And so I think one of the big energy stories this session, in addition to the $5 billion to the Texas Energy Fund, is how much effort and time the legislature put into nuclear energy. And I think this is consistent with their meta vision for energy, where they like having this energy expansion and what it means in terms of generation, but also Texas's strategic importance to the nation when it comes to overall energy production. But they also recognize that us being the nation's energy leader puts us, it certainly feeds a lot of economic growth and prosperity in the state, and they want to do what they can do to expand our energy expansion. Forgive the redundancy.
Okay, so I want to drill into the two of the different funds you talked about, the Texas Energy Fund, the $5 billion there. What does that do exactly?
Basically, what it's the Texas Energy Fund was created in 2023, and basically what it does, in a nutshell, is it works to subsidize the construction and development of dispatchable thermal electricity generation, principally your natural gas generation. And the idea behind it is that since renewables are variable, we have this duck curve where there's some times where renewables just cannot generate. We need to have more dispatchable, reliable generation, thermal generation, in order to make sure that our grid can operate 24/7, 365.
How do batteries factor into that? I mean, one of the big questions, right? You just mentioned this: the wind sometimes doesn't blow, the sun is not out for a big part of the day. There's been some debate and some conversation about whether batteries factor in. Are they able to tap into that $5 billion?
I don't know for sure if they can tap into it, but we do see batteries as being a way of making your renewable generation, your wind and solar, more reliable in the long run. But still, there were several bills that were filed this session that would have placed some speed bumps with regard to battery deployment and development across the state. And so I think the legislature, they recognize what batteries can do, but they have a lot more questions about whether or not they want to see a lot of these battery farms going up in Texas.
Okay, and you also mentioned the $350 million for Texas Advanced Nuclear Development Fund. Why are we making that investment in nuclear right now? What's driving this?
There's been a substantial amount of interest in nuclear for several reasons. One, I think there's some cutting edge research going on within institutions of higher learning in Texas. I think a lot of industry itself is looking at nuclear as a way of providing that consistent, reliable, surefire way of getting that generation. And what they did here was they created an advanced office of nuclear energy that will be housed within the office of the governor that will work with the nuclear industry with regard to permitting and site selection. And also there's a fund that would incentivize the development of nuclear energy. Again, I think a lot of it has to do with the native industry, the native research in the state, as well as an interest in, again, trying to achieve that goal of more reliable energy.
All right, well, you talked about a passion of IT investment and everything like that. Give us the pitch of why this is important, why we should pay attention to that.
I mean, we live in an increasingly digital world, and it's a cliche, but it's true. And one of the things that I've observed, I've been around this process, been around state government for years. You see that government has tended to be a little bit lagging a little bit in terms of adopting and doing the things that regular society is already doing. And so one of the things is trying to keep people's attention around how the importance of cybersecurity. It's a basic thing, right? And so with how much state-held data they have of Texans around the state, it's a huge security and privacy issue and how we govern that. So maintaining the cybersecurity of our huge state data systems. Another big part of it is, I mean, there's dozens of anecdotes, but you always have issues where you'll visit a state agency and you'll see that they're using IT systems that are from 10, 12 years ago, and they have some sort of proprietary app that's there to access some mainframe data from 30 years ago. And you hear this story and you get what's going on, but they haven't had the resources to try to, and you're just picturing all the various holes that are there and are vulnerable for any sort of, whether it's some sort of specific attack on state systems or something that's just trying to spam every government system with the same vulnerability. You're talking about extreme risk exposure. So a lot of this is about that. And then the other part is about how just government systems operate and serve Texans better. I mean, you have so many issues. I mean, I can talk about how, for example, our DFPS just put in $59 million to overhaul its case management system. And one of the big deals is you have issues where caseworkers can't go in and they have to go back into the office in order to actually enter in casework after they've been out in the field all day. They didn't have a way to do this on their mobile apps. And then there's all these issues with how things get scanned, and the data is not interoperable and not available to the different contractors. So you have just all these problems that people might take for granted if you work in the private sector, if you have a small business and you're doing everything on the cloud already. So this is not always a reality for if you work at state agencies. So, and there's numerous examples. So there's a big push to try to make sure our data systems that serve our Texans and that we use to measure our performance and keep track of what's going on are actually up to snuff and actually appropriate for the year 2025 and can deal with the threats and deal with how people's demands are over the next years.
All right, I'll ask an audience question now, which is, were there any infrastructure bills, or I'll also add, money in the budget to address hurricane preparedness, disaster relief? I'll include wildfires in that as well. What did the state do in that regard?
You can lead some of it and I can fill in.
Yeah, well, there's a fascinating trend that's going on where we're finding that extreme weather events are starting to set the legislature's agenda with increasing frequency, especially over the past 10 years. And last year, there was a historic wildfire in West Texas that decimated over a million acres. I think 3 people lost their lives. And the legislature passed a big package of wildfire bills responsive to that event. They do several things, such as improve local coordination. They help with expand certified burn manager capacity. But the legislature also made some substantive appropriations this session towards state and local wildfire response and preparedness. I think they put investments up for a state aircraft fleet, so they can now drop water bombs in areas that actually have water on wildfires, as well as bolstering local and regional resources for fighting wildfires. What else did you see in the budget?
And there was more money towards flood infrastructure. I mean, I think, and when you think about the permissible uses of what the water fund is there too, that's also maybe not the direct way to also there, but clearly a prioritization of, resiliency and what's going in there. I mean, I think they put in over $618 million towards various forms of wildfire response. So, I think it's a reflection and understanding that these are continuing to happen and a reality of Texas today.
Absolutely. Another audience question here. Did we spend down any of the rainy day fund this session?
No.
All right, there we go. It was not much of a rainy day. Another thing that, of course, the state invests a lot of money in is property tax cuts, right? Significant savings there. One thing that has sort of caught people's eye this legislative session is how much is going into the state budget to attempt to buy down property taxes, particularly school property taxes, both in money they added to the budget this session, but also to pay for past cuts in recent sessions. I believe, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that the number that was cited earlier in the session was somewhere in the $50 billion range. This raises a question that I continue to wonder about, which is that we have been in these budget cycles recently where there has been a lot of extra money and surplus funds to go around. When that happens, I think there is a strong desire in our very conservative legislature to put some of that towards buying down property taxes. But there will come a day, hopefully not anytime soon, where we're not in such a happy budget time, where the economy does take a turn for the worst. How should we be thinking about that kind of a commitment? And are there any worries about how that sets us up for the future when that, inevitable downturn comes?
That's a good question, and I think that's come up. And to the original, an earlier question that we had in terms of our discussion we had in terms of it's a reflection of what the politics of the chamber are and what folks got elected to do. And I think in a lot of ways, we've had these structural budget surpluses or fund balances or however you want to think about it. But the way it's structured, I mean, it is something that the legislature can pay for now. And if you're looking at similar revenue cycles, even if we're not necessarily looking at a crazy revenue cycle next time. It's just more a reflection of just steady growth, staying slightly outstripping inflation, which so far this fiscal year we're still kind of we're staying on that path. It's not necessarily, it's something that the state can definitely pay for, and the state wants to pay for it. And the budget writers understand that this is how they've structurally written it and everything. Now, I think that in the future, if you're looking at a severe recession or things like that, I think they have different questions on how they approach it. The way some of the property tax cuts are structured, it's, the way it's written in terms of like compression mechanisms, it's very much built into how the school finance formulas are there. So it is something that offers relief to taxpayers, even if with all the property tax like value growth that we've had. I think that the way the economy grows and shrinks, it's hard to explain that it kind of will shift both ways. So it kind of just depends on like what it looks like at that time. So if you ask me right now, I think we're fine, and what we're doing right now is sustainable. But again, I can't speak to that until I see what the revenues look like in the future too.
Sure. Okay. I want to go back to the water topic because I'm going to combine two audience questions here that I think are pretty interesting. One is, how do we proactively collaborate for regional water planning to avoid situations like Austin and Bastrop? And then another question is, there's no regulatory oversight mechanism for the state to intervene in a publicly owned water utility to help a place like Marlin. My understanding is that for Marlin, the issue isn't funding, it's local government dysfunction. What can be done with that? I'm sort of combining those two questions into one because it touches on something where this is not just a money for supply issue. There are a lot of sort of local and also regional, rural versus municipal politics about where water supply can be built. Who has access to it, who has the right to it, and how that can all be managed. Is this addressed at all in the legislation, or does it need to be addressed at all?
So, interesting perspective, Matthew. The legislature, when you look at the water code, they have routinely stated a policy preference for regionalization and regional solutions. If you type in regionalization and do a word search in the water code, it'll come up like at least 30 times. They want regions and entities within counties to work together with regard to developing water supplies and sharing them and using them. And the legislature did pass a couple bills this session. One was SB 565 by Charles Perry that removes a regulatory disincentive for regionalization. As well as another bill by Representative Senator Adam Hinojosa, that creates a model for creating public utility authorities. So you can have more entities participating in a regional service delivery model. The legislature's routinely prioritized regionalization, but still we're running into this issue where you can lead the horse up to water, but you can't make it drink. And so I think one of the things to explore moving forward is we have this new Texas Water Fund with this funding being made available. How can we prioritize funding through this fund to encourage more regional solutions?
Excellent. I have an audience question about an infrastructure topic we haven't talked about yet, which is transportation. I-35 is a major trade highway that has major constraints. Do you think the state is doing enough to support our infrastructure expansion, specifically around this aspect of our transportation infrastructure?
Transportation's always funny. I don't think the state has a problem with how much money and how much commitment they have to funding our roads and our transportation infrastructure. Now, I do think that one of the challenges is the way that our state highway plan and how our transportation plans are structured. It's designed to be a process that it's very judicious, it's very thorough, and it requires a lot of coordination between state and local entities and trying to get in the state's transportation plan for how you fund. So sometimes you may not see the quickest like kind of turnaround in terms of what the citizens' input might be on certain things, but at the same time, TxDOT and the state has numerous opportunities for people to weigh in on what their concerns are about different things. But I mean, from a resource standpoint, I think transportation is definitely something that the state of Texas puts a heavy amount of investment in and a lot of commitment, and they have a variety of funds. We did the dedicated sales tax dedication way before we did it for water, and the legislature doesn't back off on funding for our roads, and so I mean the money is there, the commitment is there. I think it kind of depends on what people want out of the road specifically, and a lot of that comes down to how that interaction goes with your locals and the state entities that are part of that process.
Okay, I'm going to combine a few different questions into one for you, which is how did green energy fare in this legislative session as we talk about energy expansion?
The two-word simple answer is it survived. There were several bills that were filed this session that would have created new regulatory or permitting regimes for wind, solar, and as I said earlier, battery storage deployment. And there were a variety of reasons for these. Like some was saying it had to do with landscape aesthetics or the impact on ecological areas. Others were saying they felt they needed to level the playing field between oil and gas and renewables. But I think one of the more compelling arguments at the end of the day was the legislature knows that our electric demands, our load is just going up. With more people coming to Texas without their own personal power plant and more energy intensive industries coming to Texas, our electricity demands are going up. And a very good case was made by the business and industry community that, look, we're growing, we need more electricity. Renewables help provide the electricity that we need so we can keep our doors open and do business in Texas. And so I think there may have been some reluctance to completely shut the door on wind and solar and battery storage development because of the recognition of the fact that they can very quickly and capably provide electrons when we need it.
All right, I'll ask y'all the same question I asked toward the end of the other panelists, which is anything under the radar that stands out to you that you feel like we should be talking about, whether that's in the budget or other infrastructure issues that have come up.
I think something that I think about a lot because we've seen strong revenue cycles, so this is not necessarily in the budget, but as we as things normalize or as they correct one way or another. And one of the things that I think about a lot is how we measure success, how we're seeing how is the government performing. And so we have a great state budget process. It's a 2-year process that involves a lot of entities. We have a ton of agencies that oversee our state agencies, state auditor's office, legislative budget board. You have Sunset Commission. There's a lot of oversight over how our agencies operate. And there was a bill this session, House Bill 12, that went towards improving our sunset process. And some of the parts of it, in addition to introducing these mid-cycle reviews and measures to improve transparency and accountability, you saw things in there to also to oversee and look at assess the performance measures that are in the state budget, which generally they're good. They're measured. They see, they correspond to like whether specific program outcomes are what they need to be. Every now and then you see some things that may not. I don't want to flame my agency friends and say what are weird or not, but there are ones that could be revised and be a better reflection of, be a better way of assessing how they're doing. So, I mean, HB 12 was a big deal. I mean, so it's not in the budget, but it's about, again, to the theme of government performance, how are our agencies doing? And so I think it'll be good to see how these reforms and not even enhancements will help our state as we go through. I mean, it's always easy when we're in rosy budget cycles, but it's always more difficult when we're looking at cuts or trying to tighten our belts. So.
All right, you got any?
Rahul, you set me up perfectly.
Okay.
So it's something that has to do with water. And at Texas 2036, we really like this issue of performance and accountability. How much are taxpayers, how much is the state getting in return from the investment of public money for certain purposes, be it public education, roads, water? There's some fascinating provisions in Senate Bill 7 that require that the Water Development report on the progress the state is making towards tackling our water infrastructure challenges. Towards that end, they have to report on how much this dedicated funding stream is working to expand our water supply portfolio, and also to a certain degree, how much this dedicated funding is working to fix aging, deteriorating, and leaking water systems. This is something that's very new to the water sector because they've always said, like, water is very important. We need a lot of money to address our challenges. What the legislature did here is said, like, okay, yes, we agree we need to invest in water infrastructure for a variety of very good reasons. But there are these provisions in Senate Bill 7 that start tracking what the state's progress and achievement will be in the long run with regard to tackling those challenges. And I think these are great provisions in Senate Bill 7. I look forward to seeing what the data says in the years to come.
Well, it has been a very eventful legislative session for all of us. I know y'all put a lot of work in, so thank you for that. The Tribune has, had reporters out there watching the late nights and all that, all throughout as well. All in the belief that the more people are informed about what's going on with their state, the better the state will be. So thank you all for helping us understand that. Please be checking our website. We'll be having recaps about these topics and more and the impact of the legislative session coming forward. And we will also have a series of events around the state, June 13th in Arlington, June 18th in San Antonio, and June 24th in San Angelo, alongside as well July 16th in Houston. So if you want to see more, you can go to texastribune.org/events to see about that, or watch them online as you could this event as well. But thank you so much. It has been a great event.